Ever confidently solve a math problem only to realize, like, oops, missed a step?
Happens to the best of us.
That feeling, though, that, wait, was I wrong the whole time? That's what we're diving into today, when our feeling of being rational bumps heads with what actually is rational.
Right, because it's tempting to think, hey, I've got my reasons, that's rational enough.
Totally.
But this philosophy paper, in defense of right reason, it argues there's like objective truths about rationality we can't just ignore, even if we disagree.
So kind of like, even if the whole world swears up and down that 2 plus 2 equals 5, doesn't change the actual math.
Exactly. And that's where the fixed point thesis comes in.
Ah.
Might sound intimidating, but the idea is pretty straightforward.
Okay, so less about fancy jargon, more about the core concept.
Exactly. At its heart, the fixed point thesis basically says being wrong about what makes something rational is, well, itself irrational.
So, like, if I'm clinging to a belief even when it's been proven illogical, that's inherently irrational.
You got it. Can't just reason our way out of everything, even if it feels justified in the moment.
Makes you think. So are we just stuck then? No wiggle room?
Well, the paper uses this concept we're all familiar with,
Oh,
akrasia.
like when you know you shouldn't have that extra slice of cake. But
Exactly. Acting against your better judgment.
the siren song of that last slice gets me every time. But how does that tie back to this objective rationality thing?
So they argue a specific type of akrasia is impossible, believing something is irrational, while simultaneously believing it is rational. They call this anti-akrasia.
Whoa, that's a mouthful. So you can't genuinely think something's both rational and irrational at the same time.
Right. Imagine someone who's adamant that climate change is fake, but then invests heavily in renewable energy.
Actions speak louder than words kind of thing.
Exactly. Their actions betray their stated beliefs. That's anti-akrasia in action. And this principle is key to the fixed point thesis. Our beliefs about what's rational have to line up with actual objective standards.
Okay, I'm starting to see how the pieces fit together, but to make it even more concrete, any real-world examples of this playing out?
Absolutely. The paper introduces us to Jane. Now, Jane is totally convinced that a specific logical inference, let's say A leads to B, is wrong, even though it's demonstrably correct.
So Jane's seeing A plus B equals C, but insisting it should be A plus C equals B. She's got her own logic, even if it doesn't quite add up for the rest of us.
Exactly. And this is where things get really interesting. Two ways of looking at Jane's situation: the top-down view and the bottom-up view.
Okay, two different lenses on the same problem. What's the top-down perspective?
So top-down says that external factors, like, say, a respected authority figure telling Jane she's right, that could actually make her false belief permissible.
Hold on. So if someone Jane really trusts, maybe a mentor, says, Jane, your logic is flawless, A plus C equals B all the way, suddenly it's okay for her to believe that, even though it's objectively still wrong.
That's the top-down view.
Wild. Okay, so then bottom up must be the opposite.
You got it. Bottom up says objective rationality wins. Doesn't matter if everyone's telling Jane she's right, the truth about that logical inference, it doesn't change.
And this is where the paper ultimately lands, right? This bottom-up approach.
Exactly. Misleading info, even from people we trust, it can't just change objective truth. That's why blindly trusting authority figures can be, well,
dangerous.
exactly. The fixed point thesis reminds us, always got to examine the logic ourselves, no matter who's presenting it.
Makes sense. But what happens when it's not just Jane versus one authority figure? What about when it's a whole group of people disagreeing on what's rational? That's got to muddy the waters even more.
Oh, absolutely. That's where it gets really interesting. The paper uses this example, Greg and Ben, to dive into this whole peer disagreement thing. So picture this. You've got Greg and Ben, both super rational dudes.
Okay, so Greg and Ben, both brilliant, same info, same logical toolkit.
Right. But they end up at totally different conclusions. Greg's like, based on the evidence, it's got to be X. But Ben, he's convinced, no way, it's Y all the way.
Now I'm picturing them like at a chalkboard arguing over an equation or something, each one convinced they've cracked the code. So how do we figure out who's actually being more rational here?
Well, there are a couple of main schools of thought on this. One says, when you're facing a disagreement with someone equally rational, you should just split the difference.
So Greg and Ben should be like, well, guess we'll never know. That seems kind of anticlimactic, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It can feel that way. But the other view, the right reasons view, says, look, if you got to your conclusion through solid reasoning, it's actually more rational to stick to your guns. Don't just follow the crowd, even if it's just a crowd of one other person.
So Greg, with his X answer, he should hold on to that because he's sure of his reasoning, even with Ben disagreeing. That makes sense, but it does make you wonder about the whole crowd aspect. What if it wasn't just Ben disagreeing with Greg? What if it was a whole room full of experts?
Ah, the crowdsourcing dilemma. What happens when those dissenting voices start to multiply? Should Greg stand his ground, or does the sheer number of people disagreeing change what's considered rational? And get this, the paper argues that this scenario, the crowdsourcing one, it actually makes the right reasons view even stronger.
Really? How so? It seems like the more people disagree with you, the less likely you are to be right.
Think about it this way. If Greg should just automatically side with the crowd of experts, shouldn't even one person disagreeing give him at least a little pause?
I guess so. If one person's disagreement means nothing, then logically 1,000 shouldn't either, right? But we know that's not how it works in the real world. Something about being in the minority makes us second guess ourselves.
Exactly, and that's what the paper highlights. If we just blindly side with the majority, even when their reasoning might be off, just because there are more of them, that's a slippery slope, right?
So are we stuck between either stubbornly clinging to our own beliefs or are getting swayed by whoever shouts the loudest? Seems like a tough spot to be in. Any way to find a middle ground.
Now that is the question, isn't it? The paper acknowledges that some situations, like this crowdsourcing thing, they might just be genuine rational dilemmas, meaning no matter what you choose, you're going to violate some principle of rationality.
So like a logic puzzle with no right answer, every path leads to a contradiction.
Kinda, yeah. But just recognizing that these dilemmas exist is huge. It means we're not chasing after some perfect, flawless rationality, which, let's face it, might not even be possible. Instead, it's about understanding where logic has its limits and choosing the most rational path, even if it's got a few bumps along the way.
It's kind of freeing in a way, right? Like, perfect rationality might not be the goal after all. It's more about knowing the pitfalls and making the most rational choices, even when I don't have all the pieces.
Exactly. And that brings up this whole other question I find fascinating about credences.
Credences. Now, remind me, that's about how strongly we believe in something. Yeah.
You got it. Not just believing it, but like, how sure are we? I might believe it'll be sunny tomorrow, but I'm way more certain that, the Earth goes around the sun. Different levels of credence.
Right, right. Makes sense. So, how does that play into this whole objective rationality thing, especially when we're talking about disagreements?
So let's go back to Greg for a sec. He's done his calculations, feeling good about his X answer, but now he's got 1,000 experts saying, nope, you're off. Even if he doesn't actually change his answer, wouldn't all those dissenting voices at least make him a little unsure?
Yeah, I'd think so. Even if he still thinks his logic holds up, that many people disagreeing, gotta make you second guess at least a little. So, what does that do to his belief then?
Right. That's the heart of it. If Greg's really supposed to stick to X because he trusts his reasoning, can his credence, that gut feeling of certainty, still take a hit? And does that internal wavering, that shift in credence, mess with how rational the belief actually is?
Makes you wonder, can you really say a belief is rational if deep down you're not so sure anymore? Like, if those what ifs start creeping in.
Exactly. It's like this weird dance between how certain we feel and what the cold, hard logic is telling us. And that's kind of the open question the paper leaves us with.
Yeah.
Where does feeling end and true logic begin?
Man, that's a brain twister. So we've gone deep on the fixed point thesis, tackled Akrasia, even questioned the nature of certainty itself, all thanks to this one little philosophy paper.
It just goes to show, being rational isn't about having all the answers. It's about being open to the questions, refining how we think, and accepting that even logic has its limits.
Totally. And on that note, we'll leave everyone with those limits to ponder. Until next time, keep those brains buzzing, and we'll catch you on the next deep dive.